guys, and welcome to the channel, History Matters and Matters of History, where I present my thoughts, opinions, muses on various topics and events based on current observations, and of course events that have happened in the past. Because these events are history, but they are also matters of history. So we're going to talk about that today. So this episode is entitled DEI, the Rook of the Racist Heart. In 1981, Lee Atwater, who was the campaign strategist for Ronald Reagan, was interviewed by Alexander Lamis, a political scientist and author of The Two-Party South. And in that interview, Atwater was highlighting the evolution of political messaging and how the GOP in particular had adapted its rhetoric to appeal to white Southern voters. He argued that by 1980, the Republican Party isn't really running based on race, but on issues, things like fiscal conservatism, cutting taxes, balancing the budget, etc. These are the things he points out that Reagan campaigns on and wins over Southern whites. And by campaigning that way, it differentiated Ronald Reagan from someone like George Wallace, who, as we knew, was all about race. And to that, Lamis apparently poses a question by making the observation that Reagan, while not overtly engaging in racial politics, wins over George Wallace voters by eliminating certain legal services and cutting things like food stamps, policies that affect marginalized communities. The question he seems to be asking is, how is it that Reagan is able to do that if he's not engaging in racial politics? To that question, Atwater attempts to explain how he, as a statistician, would approach that problem. He starts out by saying that you have to get abstract in your messaging. So he gives an example. He says that in 1954, you can use the N-word, but in 1968, after civil rights, that's going to get you in trouble, so you can't use it. But you can say things like forced busing, states' rights, or cutting taxes. All of these are economic things that have the byproduct of hurting blacks more than whites. These are the words of a Republican strategist who worked on Ronald Reagan's campaign on how it is possible that Reagan himself won over the kind of voters that would support a George Wallace. Forced busing, states' rights, cutting taxes, oh yes, DEI, weaponized to mean people of color, the rook of the racist heart. You see, in the world of card games, we have spades and poker, for example, and they're played with a standard deck of playing cards. But there is also a card game called Rook. It uses a completely different deck, and the cards look different. Now, those of us who have played spades know the rules of the game, and I'm here to tell you that they are very similar to the game of Rook, such that if you take the 11, 12, 13, and 14 cards of a Rook deck and assign them the rank of Jack, Queen, King, Ace, respectively, cards found in a standard playing deck. And then if you remove the one card from each suit, bringing the number of cards in that Rook deck down to 52, because it has 57 cards in it, or you can bring it down to 53 if you're going to play with a joker, or in this case, the bird card. If you do those things, you can then play spades with a Rook deck, so long as you apply the rules of the game of spades, and everyone understands that. The 11 and 12 cards, for example, have been effectively weaponized such that they no longer have their original meaning. And if you've never played spades before, you'll not recognize it being played with a Rook deck. And if you're in the game, you'll lose every time. The game of race and politics today is being played with a Rook deck in place of a standard deck of cards. In other words, it's coded. DEI is the Rook card. And like the 11 card, for example, it no longer means its face value, diversity, equity, and inclusion, but means Jack, Queen, affirmative action, Blacks, people of color. Indeed, when the President of the United States says that diversity, equity, and inclusion is responsible for the tragic plane crash in a city whose population of color is 56%, and where the air traffic controllers are likely to be made up of that population, what he's saying is that because of affirmative action, unqualified, unintelligent, he made it a point to state that the FAA hires individuals with intellectual disabilities. What he is saying is that Blacks are responsible for that tragedy, and in an indirect way, justifying his revocation of an executive order by Lyndon Baines Johnson. But let me say that DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and affirmative action are two different things. DEI is the product of affirmative action rather than the other way around. Affirmative action essentially deals with discriminatory practices based on race and gender when it comes to hiring, etc. And it indeed does target people of color. Diversity, equity, and inclusion, on the other hand, builds upon that by including other groups of individuals, but also addresses socioeconomic barriers. So it isn't just people of color or LGBTQ folks, but also individuals with disabilities, veterans, for example, seniors even. See, simple things like ramps and sidewalks for those who are confined to wheelchairs. Those are DEI policies. Paid paternal leave, DEI policies. Are you a vegetarian? In order to have those food options available at various places in public, yes, DEI. The subtitles and captions available on TV. The sign language interpreters we see during official government statements, particularly during weather events. Oh, legislation in my state in the early 2000s, which allowed my asthmatic patients the ability to keep their rescue medications on their persons as opposed to being in the nurse's office. Oh yes, that is diversity, equity, and inclusion. Those are just a few. And notice that none of them have anything to do with race, yet the far right will have us believe that diversity, equity, and inclusion is nothing more than race-based policy. Hence, the rook of the racist heart, because that is the value they've assigned to the DEI card and are playing it as they would in the game of racial spades. If you remove those policies, who do you think that affects? Not whom you think, because it's not all about hiring and jobs, but about access to services. So you see, it's just not one group of individuals that it affects. It's a whole lot of other people. Your grandparents, veterans who lost a leg in a war, perhaps your disabled child might have a physical disability, ain't nothing wrong with their brain, but yet removal of DEI policy prevents them from access. Something to think about. Lastly, for people of color, what does the revocation of Lyndon Johnson's Executive Order 11246 mean? Well, when you consider that it superseded John F. Kennedy's Executive Order 10925, and that order was one of the foundations for the Civil Rights Act of 1964 itself, then you might get a different perspective of the climate that we are currently in and what is on the horizon. History matters. Matters of history. My muse for the day, and that's the way it is. Thanks for tuning in. Hit the subscribe button if you like. we'll talk to you later.